I stood alone in the chaos of Mexico City International Airport, watching my son Brad's plane disappear into the clouds. My wallet was gone. My passport was gone. My phone was gone. My return ticket was gone. Brad had taken everything. He had deliberately stranded me here, penniless and without documents, in a foreign country where I barely spoke the language. The abandonment hit me like a fist to the chest. This wasn't an accident. My own son had planned this. And I knew exactly why. Brad wanted me dead, so he could claim my house in Portland. I sank onto a cold metal bench in the terminal, my mind spinning through the last 72 hours like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. How had I been so blind? Just 3 days ago, Brad had shown up at my doorstep in Portland with that wide smile I hadn't seen in 2 years. He hugged me tight and said he wanted to make things right between us. He proposed this father and son trip to Mexico City to reconnect, to heal our relationship. I should have been suspicious. Brad hadn't called me in months, but I was lonely. My wife Sarah had been gone for 8 years. I wanted to believe my son still loved me. Brad insisted on handling all the travel arrangements. He said he wanted to take care of everything, to show me he'd grown up and become responsible. Like a fool, I let him. He held my passport for safekeeping. He kept my wallet in his bag because the hotel safe was broken. He made all the reservations and held both our tickets. I trusted him completely. Those 3 days in Mexico City should have warned me. Brad kept pushing alcohol at every meal, encouraging me to relax and let my guard down. He was overly attentive in a way that felt rehearsed. On the second night, over dinner at an expensive restaurant I knew he couldn't afford, he casually mentioned that I should really update my will. He said he'd already taken care of some house deed paperwork to help me out. I was too tipsy to question what that meant. This morning at the hotel, Brad told me to enjoy a leisurely breakfast while he checked us both in for our afternoon flight. He said he'd meet me at the airport. When I arrived at the terminal 2 hours later, Brad was already through security. He gave me a brief, cold goodbye through the glass partition. He said he'd see me back home and wished me safe travels. Then he turned and walked away without looking back. I tried to check in at the airline counter. The agent told me there was no ticket in the system for Matthew Harrison. I searched my carry-on bag frantically. My wallet wasn't there. My passport wasn't there. My phone was gone. Everything was gone. Brad had cleaned me out completely. Airport security was no help. They thought I was some confused American tourist trying to scam my way onto a flight. They threatened to remove me from the terminal for loitering. I tried to explain in my broken Spanish that my son had stolen my documents, but they didn't believe me. One officer laughed and said American families were always dramatic. I sat on that bench for an hour, watching travelers rush past me with their families, their documents, their normal lives. I had nothing. No way to prove who I was. No way to get home. No way to contact anyone. I was 70 years old, stuck in a foreign country. And my own son had done this to me deliberately. A janitor pushing a cleaning cart stopped near my bench. He was a Mexican man, in his 50s, named Carlos. He must have seen the desperation on my face, because he approached me carefully and asked in broken English if I needed help. I nearly broke down right there. I explained my situation as best I could. Carlos listened, his face growing more sympathetic. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old cell phone. The screen was cracked, but it worked. He told me I could make one call, just one, because he had very few minutes left on his plan. My hands shook as I dialed the only number I'd memorized besides Brad's. It belonged to George, my neighbor back in Portland. George was a retired police officer who lived 2 houses down. We'd been friends for 20 years. George answered on the third ring. The relief I felt hearing his voice almost made me cry, but what George told me next turned my blood to ice. He said Brad had called him 2 days ago. Brad told George and all the neighbors that I had died of a heart attack in Mexico. He said it happened suddenly at the hotel. He said the body was being cremated locally per my wishes. George said Brad had already filed death certificate paperwork, and right now, at this very moment, Brad was at my house in Portland moving furniture out. He was stealing everything. The call cut off. Carlos's phone had died. I stared at the blank screen, my entire world collapsing. My son hadn't just abandoned me, he had declared me dead. He was already erasing me from existence and claiming my life's work as his own. Carlos saw my face go pale. I must have looked like I was about to pass out because he grabbed my arm and helped me sit back down. I told him what George had said. Carlos shook his head in disgust and said something in Spanish that I guessed was not complimentary to Brad. I had maybe 6 hours before Brad could forge enough documents to steal my house permanently. The house I'd worked 3 jobs to keep after Sarah died. The house where I'd raised Brad alone from age 12. The house worth $800,000 in Portland's hot real estate market. My entire life was in that house, and my son was gutting it like a fish while pretending I was dead. Carlos made a decision. He told me his cousin Javier ran a cargo truck to the Texas border. It was a 16-hour drive, but if I could get to Texas, I could reach an American embassy or consulate. I'd be on American soil. Carlos said he'd take me to meet Javier right now. I had no papers, no identification, no money. Crossing the border legally was impossible. But Carlos and Javier had a plan. Javier regularly smuggled goods across the border. He could hide me among the cargo. It was illegal. It was dangerous. If we got caught, I could be arrested. But I had no other choice. Brad was winning, and I was running out of time. We left the airport immediately. Carlos drove me in his old pickup truck to a warehouse on the outskirts of Mexico City. Javier was loading boxes into a large cargo truck. He was younger than Carlos, maybe 40, with suspicious eyes that softened when Carlos explained my situation in rapid Spanish. Javier agreed to help but warned me the journey would be difficult. I'd have to hide in the cargo area among boxes and crates. The truck had no air conditioning back there. Border Patrol would inspect the cargo at the checkpoint. I'd have to stay absolutely silent. And still, if they found me, we'd all go to jail. I climbed into the back of that truck and found a space between wooden crates. Javier covered me with a tarp and closed the doors. The darkness was complete. The heat was suffocating. The truck started moving, and I felt every bump in the road jar through my old bones. Hours passed. I lost track of time in the darkness. My back ached. My legs cramped. I was hungry and thirsty, but I didn't dare make a sound. Then the truck slowed and stopped. I heard voices outside. Spanish at first, then English. Border Patrol. My heart hammered in my chest so hard I thought they'd hear it. The cargo doors opened. Flashlight beams swept over the boxes. An agent climbed inside and walked within 2 feet of where I lay, hidden under the tarp. I held my breath until my lungs burned. The agent moved boxes, checked labels, knocked on crates. Then he climbed out. The doors closed. The truck started moving again. We'd made it through the checkpoint. I was in Texas, American soil. For the first time in hours, I let myself breathe normally. But we'd only been driving on the American side for maybe 4 hours when the truck started making terrible grinding noises. Javier pulled over. I heard him cursing in Spanish. The engine had thrown a belt, or something worse. We were broken down in the middle of nowhere on a dark Texas highway. Javier opened the cargo doors and helped me out. My legs nearly gave out when I tried to stand. I'd been cramped in that space for 12 hours. He showed me the engine. Even I could see it was bad. He had no money for repairs. We were stranded. And every minute we sat here was another minute Brad had to steal everything I owned. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I'd survived the airport, survived the border crossing, survived being smuggled in a cargo truck, and now this. I sat on the roadside in the dark, feeling hope drain out of me like water from a broken cup. Then headlights appeared on the highway. A large recreational vehicle slowed down and pulled over. An older couple got out. The man was in his 70s with a military bearing. The woman was smaller, with kind eyes and a nurse's efficient manner. The man introduced himself as Frank. His wife was Helen. They'd seen us broken down and stopped to help. I explained our situation carefully, leaving out the illegal border crossing part. I told them about Brad, about being stranded in Mexico, about needing to get home to Portland before my son stole my house. Frank stared at me for a long moment. Then his face broke into a shocked smile. He said my name. Matthew Harrison. He knew me. We'd served together in Vietnam 43 years ago. We'd been in the same unit for 8 months before Frank rotated home. I hadn't seen him since 1972. What were the odds? Frank said they were driving from Arizona to El Paso in their RV. They could take me north. El Paso had a Veterans Affairs hospital. With my military service records, the VA could verify my identity even without a passport. They could issue emergency travel documents. I could fly home from there. I felt hope surge back. Frank and Helen were like angels on that dark highway. I started to climb into their RV, thanking them over and over. Then my stomach cramped violently. The pain doubled me over. I collapsed on the roadside. Helen rushed to me. She checked my pulse and felt my forehead. Her face went serious. She said I had a severe fever. She asked what I'd eaten. I remembered the airport food from this morning. Some kind of meat sandwich from a vendor cart. It had tasted off, but I was hungry. Helen said I had food poisoning. Bad food poisoning. I was dangerously dehydrated, and my fever was climbing. She said we needed to get me to a hospital in the next town immediately, or I could go into shock. I refused. I begged them to just get me to the border. Frank said the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away. I said no. If I didn't get home in the next 12 hours, I'd lose everything anyway. I told them I'd rather die trying than lose my home to my son's betrayal. Helen warned me I could actually die if we didn't treat this. The food poisoning was severe, but I was beyond caring about my own survival. What good was surviving if Brad stole 50 years of my life? Frank looked at Helen. She looked at me. Then she made a decision. She said they'd get me to the border as fast as possible, but she'd treat me in the RV while we drove. She had a first aid kit and some basic medical supplies. It wasn't ideal, but it might keep me alive long enough. They helped me into the RV. As we pulled away, I looked back at Javier standing by his broken truck. I hoped Carlos would find him and get him home safely. Those two men had risked everything to help a stranger. I owed them my life. The RV raced through the night while I lay on a fold-out bed in the back, my body racked with fever and chills. Helen worked over me like the professional nurse she'd been for 30 years before retiring. She made me sip water constantly to fight the dehydration. She pressed cold compresses to my forehead. She checked my vital signs every 20 minutes. My temperature kept climbing. 102, 103, 104. I drifted in and out of consciousness. In my fever dreams, I relived raising Brad after Sarah died. He was only 12 when cancer took her. Too young to lose his mother. I'd been devastated, drowning in grief, but I had to be strong for him. I worked 3 jobs. I did overtime every week. I missed sleep. I missed meals. But I kept that house. I kept Brad clothed and fed and in good schools. I put him through college. I gave him everything. When had he started resenting me? When had love turned to greed? 2 years ago, Brad's tech startup failed. He'd burned through investor money on a social media app that never launched. He came to me desperate, begging me to co-sign business loans using the house as collateral. He needed $300,000. He promised he'd pay it back. He said this was his last chance to make it big. I refused. I knew Brad was a poor risk. He'd always been impulsive with money, always chasing the next big idea without thinking it through. If I co-signed those loans, and he defaulted, I'd lose the house. I couldn't risk that. The house was all I had left of Sarah, of our life together. Brad didn't speak to me for 6 months after that. When he finally called again, he was cold, distant. He only reached out on holidays with brief, obligatory messages. Then 2 months ago, he showed up at my door with that warm smile and talk of reconciliation. This trip to Mexico was supposed to heal our relationship. Instead, it was all a setup, a plan to get rid of me permanently and claim his inheritance early. Frank's voice cut through my fever dreams. He was on his cell phone with someone. I heard him say the words, Veterans Affairs Hospital in El Paso. He was calling in a favor. Frank had connections at the VA through his old military buddy Richard, who worked in administration there. Richard could fast-track my case. They'd admit me as a medical emergency and verify my identity through the military database. Dawn broke over Texas as we approached El Paso. My fever had spiked to 104.8. Helen said we'd gotten me here just in time. Any longer, and I could have had organ failure. The border crossing was a blur. Frank and Helen showed their documents. The agents saw me unconscious and feverish in the back. Helen, in full nurse mode, insisted it was a medical emergency. They waved us through without question. The VA hospital was massive, a sprawling complex on El Paso's east side. Frank pulled right up to the emergency entrance. Hospital staff rushed out with a wheelchair. They got me inside and hooked up to IV fluids within minutes. The cool liquid flowing into my veins felt like salvation. My fever started dropping almost immediately. Richard, Frank's friend, came down from administration. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s, with the patient demeanor of someone who dealt with VA bureaucracy for decades. He pulled up my military service records on his computer. Matthew Joseph Harrison, Army, Vietnam veteran, service dates, unit numbers, medals, discharge status, everything matched. He printed out a temporary VA identification card with my photo from the military database. It wasn't a passport, but it was official federal identification. It would get me on a plane. I was lying in that hospital bed, IV in my arm, finally feeling like I might actually make it home, when Richard got a phone call. He listened for a moment. His face changed. He hung up and looked at me with something like shock. He said that was the Social Security Administration. According to federal records, I'd been legally declared deceased as of 3 days ago. Death certificate filed in Oregon by my next of kin, Bradley Harrison. My bank accounts were frozen. My Social Security benefits had been terminated. The deed transfer on my house was already in process. I was legally dead in the government system. Richard said, even though I was physically sitting in front of him, alive and breathing, legally proving I was still alive, would take weeks of paperwork and court hearings. Until then, I had no legal access to my house, my bank accounts, my property, nothing. I was a ghost. Brad had won. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something. I'd survived abandonment, food poisoning, an illegal border crossing, and a near-death fever, and now the government itself was telling me I didn't exist. Brad had turned me into a legal phantom. Richard saw my face and quickly explained my options. He said reversing a death certificate required petitioning the court, providing multiple forms of identification, witness affidavits, and sometimes even DNA evidence. The process typically took 6 to 8 weeks. By then, Brad would have sold the house and vanished with the money. There was nothing I could do legally. I was trapped in bureaucratic limbo. I asked him what I could do right now, today, this minute. Richard paused, then said something interesting. He said legally I couldn't do anything. I had no standing. But if I could physically get myself to my house and prove face-to-face to local authorities that I was alive, the fraud would become undeniable. It wouldn't be a civil matter anymore. It would be criminal fraud. Brad could be arrested immediately. Frank and Helen were still in the waiting room. When I told them what Richard had said, they didn't hesitate. Frank said they'd drive me to Portland. It was 1,800 miles. They could do it in 18 hours if they drove straight through and took turns at the wheel. We'd leave immediately. Frank called George from the road while Helen drove. George answered on the first ring. He'd been desperate to hear from me. He said the situation in Portland had gotten worse. Brad had brought his girlfriend Amber and her brother Kyle to the house. They were loading my belongings into a moving truck. They'd told all the neighbors I'd died peacefully in Mexico, and they were handling estate matters. Brad had shown the death certificate to anyone who asked questions. He'd even hired a real estate agent. The house was going on the market tomorrow morning at $850,000. George said he'd tried calling the police, but they said it was a civil estate dispute and they couldn't intervene without a court order. Frank pushed the RV to 70 miles per hour on Interstate 40. My body was still weak from the food poisoning, but at least the fever was gone. Helen made me eat crackers and drink electrolyte water. She said I needed strength for what was coming. During the long drive, Frank and Helen told me their story. 5 years ago, they'd lost their son to a financial con artist who'd posed as an investment advisor. He'd convinced their son to put his life savings into a fake cryptocurrency scheme. When it all collapsed, their son killed himself from the shame and debt. Frank and Helen spent 3 years tracking down that con artist and testifying at his trial. They understood betrayal by the people you're supposed to trust. They understood the need for justice. Helen asked me why I thought Brad had done this. I was silent for a long time before answering. I said the house was worth enough to solve all Brad's financial problems. He saw me as an obstacle between him and financial security. He'd probably rationalized it somehow, convinced himself I'd lived long enough, that I was old, and he deserved his inheritance. People can justify anything when money is involved. We'd been driving for 12 hours when Helen got a phone call. Her face went pale. Her sister in Phoenix had just had a massive stroke. She was in the ICU. The doctors said the next 24 hours were critical. Helen looked at Frank with tears in her eyes. They had to go to Phoenix. Immediately, I understood. Family came first. I told them to go, to take care of Helen's sister. But Phoenix was 8 hours in the wrong direction from Portland. By the time they could detour there and then get me to Portland, it would be too late. Brad would have finalized everything. Frank pulled over at a truck stop outside Flagstaff, Arizona. They gave me $200 in cash. It was all they had on them. Helen hugged me tight and made me promise to see a doctor again as soon as I could. Frank wrote down Richard's number at the VA and told me to call if I needed anything. Then they drove south toward Phoenix, and I was alone again at a truck stop in Arizona with no identification and barely enough money for food. I sat at a grimy table in the truck stop diner, feeling the weight of 70 years pressing down on me. I was so tired, so beaten down. Part of me wanted to give up, to let Brad have the house, to just disappear and start over somewhere no one knew me. But that would mean Brad won. That would mean all his cruelty and betrayal got rewarded. I couldn't let that happen. I noticed a bulletin board by the diner entrance covered in flyers and business cards. One posting caught my eye. Driver needed. Delivery to Seattle. Leaving now. Cash pay. There was a phone number. I used the diner's phone to call. A gruff voice answered. His name was Jerry. He was at the truck stop right now, about to leave. He needed someone to help him stay awake on the long drive, and maybe help with unloading. He'd pay $50 and provide food. I found Jerry at his semi-truck. He was maybe 55, weathered face, suspicious eyes. He looked me up and down and asked where my stuff was. I said I traveled light. He asked for identification. I said I'd lost my wallet. He started to walk away. I called after him that I'd worked the entire drive just for a ride to Portland. It was on the way to Seattle. I'd help with everything. I just needed to get home. Jerry stopped. He asked why I was so desperate. I told him the truth. All of it. Mexico, the abandonment, the death certificate, Brad stealing my house, everything. Jerry listened without expression. When I finished, he went quiet for a long moment. Then he told me his story. His father had died last year. Jerry's brother had tried to forge their father's will to claim everything. Jerry fought him in court for 8 months and lost everything anyway. Lawyers took most of the estate in fees. His brother got the rest. Jerry understood family betrayal. But then Jerry's expression hardened. He asked me how he could know I was really Matthew Harrison. How did he know I wasn't some con artist drifter trying to steal a dead man's house? I had no identification, no proof, nothing. I tried to explain about the VA hospital, about Richard's temporary ID card, but I'd left it in Frank and Helen's RV in my fevered confusion. I had nothing to prove who I was. Jerry reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a small pistol. He pointed it at me and told me to get out of his truck. He said for all he knew, I was the criminal here. He wasn't going to help some stranger break into someone's house. I stood there with a gun pointed at my chest, 400 miles from home, with no way to prove my own identity. This was it. This was as far as I could go. I'd failed. I looked at that gun barrel and felt something break inside me. I was too tired to be afraid anymore. I told Jerry to go ahead and call the police if he wanted. I told him to call the VA hospital in El Paso and ask for Richard in administration. I gave him Richard's direct number from memory. I told him to call my neighbor George in Portland. I rattled off George's address and phone number. I told him every detail about my military service, my wife Sarah's maiden name, the exact address of my house, the year I bought it, the type of siding, the color of the front door. I told him everything only the real Matthew Harrison would know. Jerry kept the gun pointed at me but pulled out his phone. He called the VA hospital. He asked for Richard. Put it on speaker. Richard answered and confirmed everything I'd said. I was Matthew Harrison. I'd been treated there yesterday. I was in serious trouble and needed help getting home. Richard told Jerry I was telling the truth. Jerry lowered the gun. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said he was sorry. He said he'd been burned too many times by liars and con artists. He'd lost his family to one. He didn't trust anyone anymore. But he believed me now. He'd get me to Portland. We drove through the afternoon and into the evening. Jerry pushed the speed limit on Interstate 84 through Idaho and into Oregon. We were making good time. My body ached from days of stress and illness. But my mind was sharp now, focused on what had to happen when I got home. George called Jerry's phone around 8 p.m. He'd been waiting to hear from me. He told me what was happening at the house right then. Brad, Amber, and Kyle were having a celebration dinner in my dining room. They were drinking my wine, eating steaks, toasting their inheritance. George had heard Brad through the window talking about vacation plans to Cabo. They thought they'd won. They thought I was dead and cremated in Mexico and the house was theirs. I felt rage burn through me like acid. While I'd been fighting for my life across 2 countries, my son was celebrating my murder in my own home. Jerry asked me what my plan was. I said I was going to walk in that front door and confront Brad face to face. Jerry said that wouldn't work. With the death certificate filed, the police might arrest me for identity theft or trespassing in Brad's house. Since legally it was Brad's house now and I was legally dead, we needed proof. Video proof. Undeniable evidence that I was alive and Brad knew it. George had an idea. He had a security camera system on his house. He could angle one camera toward my front door. When I showed up and walked in, the camera would capture everything. We'd have video proof of me alive, confronting Brad, and Brad's reaction. That combined with witness testimony would be enough for the police to arrest Brad immediately for fraud. We rolled into Portland just after midnight. Jerry dropped me 2 blocks from my house. I stood on the sidewalk of my own neighborhood like a stranger. The streetlights cast long shadows. Everything looked familiar but felt wrong, like coming home from war. To find your house still standing but knowing everything inside had changed. George was waiting outside his house with camera equipment. He'd set up his security camera system to record. He whispered that Brad, Amber, and Kyle were all still inside my house. They'd been drinking heavily. They were loud and careless. George had heard everything through the walls. My hands shook as I pulled out my house key. I'd had that key on my ring for 48 years. I'd never thought I'd need to use it to break into my own home. We crept across my lawn in the darkness. I could see lights on inside. I could hear Brad's voice, loud and drunk, laughing about something. I heard Amber's high-pitched giggle. Music was playing. They were having a party in my house, while the neighborhood thought I was dead. I reached the front door. George positioned himself behind a hedge with the camera running. I put my key in the lock. I turned it. Nothing happened. The lock didn't move. I tried again. Nothing. The key didn't work, George whispered from the hedge. He said Brad had changed all the locks this afternoon. A locksmith came and replaced every lock in the house. Brad had locked me out of my own home. I tried the side door. Changed. I tried the back door. Changed. Every entrance to my house had been rekeyed. I stood in my own backyard, listening to my son celebrate inside, and I couldn't get in. I couldn't reach him. I was locked out of 50 years of my own life. The darkness felt crushing. I sank to my knees on the grass of the backyard I'd mowed 1,000 times. This was it, the darkest moment. I was right here, alive, home, and I still couldn't stop Brad. He'd thought of everything. He'd won. George appeared beside me. He put his hand on my shoulder. He said there was one more way in. The basement window. The small one on the east side of the house. He remembered I'd never fixed the broken latch. It had been stuck half open for years. I'd always meant to repair it, but never got around to it. That window might still be accessible. I looked up at George. That window was tiny, maybe 2 feet wide, and it was 4 feet off the ground. I was 70 years old, with a body that had been through hell for the past 4 days, but it was the only way in. I crawled across the lawn to the east side of my house. There it was, the little rectangular basement window with the broken latch, exactly as I'd left it 2 weeks ago. The window was designed to let light into the basement, not to let people through, but it was open about 6 inches. I pushed on the frame. It was old, swollen with moisture, stubborn. But it moved. Inch by inch, I forced it wider. 12 inches, 18 inches, 20 inches. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. George helped me position myself. I'd have to go in head first. If I got stuck, I'd be trapped halfway through my own basement window, like some kind of pathetic burglar. But I had no choice. This was the only way. I squeezed my head and shoulders through. The frame scraped my sides. My shirt caught and tore. I wiggled forward, using my hands on the basement floor to pull myself. My hips caught on the frame. I thought I was stuck. Then George pushed my feet, and I popped through, falling 4 feet onto my basement concrete floor. Pain shot through my shoulder where I landed wrong. I lay there for a moment, bruised and scraped and aching. But I was inside. I was in my own house. And Brad had no idea I was here. I stood slowly in my own basement, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. My workbench, my tools, the shelves with Sarah's holiday decorations. This space hadn't been touched yet. Brad hadn't gotten down here to clear it out. But upstairs, I could hear him. His voice carried through the floorboards. He was talking on the phone. George called Jerry's phone, which I still had. He whispered that the camera was recording. Whatever happened next would be captured on video. I just needed to get upstairs and confront Brad with George as a witness outside. I climbed the basement stairs slowly. Each step was familiar. I'd walked these stairs thousands of times. But tonight felt different. Tonight I was a ghost returning to haunt the living. At the top of the basement stairs, I opened the door into my kitchen. The lights were on. I saw my coffee maker on the counter, but everything else was different. Boxes were stacked everywhere. My dishes were packed. My pots and pans were wrapped in newspaper. The room I'd cooked in for decades was being erased. I moved through the kitchen into the hallway. More boxes. My family photos were taken down from the walls and thrown into cardboard boxes without care. I saw a picture of Sarah on our wedding day sticking out of a trash bag. They were throwing away my wife's memory like garbage. Brad's voice got louder. He was in the living room. I could hear him clearly now. He was on the phone with his lawyer. He was saying the cremation was scheduled for 10 in the morning. After that, they'd list the house. He expected to close on the sale within a week. Portland's market was hot. Houses like mine sold fast. He was laughing. He told his lawyer they should all go to Cabo to celebrate. He'd earned this, he said. He deserved it after dealing with a selfish old man for so long. I felt rage so pure it cleared my head. This was my son. The baby boy Sarah and I had held in the hospital. The child I'd raised alone after cancer took his mother. The young man I'd put through college. This was what he'd become. I stepped into the doorway of my living room. Brad was on the couch with Amber curled beside him. Kyle sat in my recliner with his feet up, drinking my beer. The room was trashed. Empty bottles everywhere. Pizza boxes on the coffee table. My furniture was pushed against the walls, labeled with stickers that said, "Sell," or "Donate," or "Trash." I stood there in the doorway, thin and haggard from 4 days of hell, but alive. Very much alive. I said, "Oh, you're back." Brad's head snapped toward me. His phone fell from his hand. The beer bottle in Kyle's hand slipped and shattered on the floor. Amber screamed, a high-pitched shriek that probably woke the neighbors. Brad's face went white, actually white, like he'd seen a ghost. Which I suppose he had. He tried to speak, but only managed to stammer. "Dad? But you. How?" I stepped further into the room. "Dead? In Mexico? Cremated tomorrow? Sorry to ruin your party, son." Kyle jumped up from the recliner. "Who the hell is this? How'd you get in?" Brad was still staring at me like I was an apparition. Amber grabbed his arm. "Brad, is that really?" "My father," Brad whispered. Then something shifted in his face. The shock transformed into calculation. He stood up, regaining composure. "Dad. Oh my God, we thought. The hospital called. They said you had a heart attack. We've been making funeral arrangements. I cut him off. Stop. I know everything. You stole my documents. You abandoned me at the airport. You filed a false death certificate. You're trying to steal my house. Brad's expression hardened. His voice went cold. Prove it. You have no identification. No passport. No papers. You're legally dead. For all anyone knows, you're an imposter. Some homeless guy trying to steal a dead man's house. Amber stood beside him nodding. We should call the police. This man broke into Brad's house. Kyle moved toward me. Yeah, old man. You're trespassing. You need to leave before you get hurt. I didn't move. I stood my ground in my own living room. This is my house. I've lived here for 48 years. You leave. Brad actually smiled. It was a cruel smile. He walked to a folder on the coffee table and pulled out papers. Actually, as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, this house transferred to me. I have the deed paperwork right here. You have nothing. I own this house now. You're trespassing in my property. He pulled out his phone and started dialing. I'm calling the police. We'll see who they believe. A dead man with no papers, or me, with legal documents and a death certificate. I watched him dial. I didn't try to stop him. Instead, I smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. Go ahead, I said. Call them. I have a surprise for you. Brad paused, his finger hovering over the screen. What surprise? While you were busy forging death certificates, I said. I was busy too. I documented everything. The VA hospital in El Paso treated me and verified my identity. They issued an affidavit that I'm alive. My neighbor George has been recording you clearing out this house while telling everyone I'm dead. And right now, George is outside with a camera recording this entire conversation through the window. Brad glanced toward the window. His confidence wavered for just a second. Every word you just said about thinking you'd gotten away with it? Recorded. Your lawyer's name? Recorded. Everything. Brad's face shifted through emotions. Panic, then anger, then something like defiance. He laughed. It was a harsh sound. So what? You're still legally dead. Those recordings mean nothing until you go through months of court proceedings. By then, I'll have sold this house and disappeared with the money. You can't stop me. The law is on my side. He stepped closer to me. Kyle moved to flank him. Brad's voice dropped low and mean. Now get out of my house, before Kyle throws you out. I didn't move. I looked my son in the eye. I said I have a surprise. I didn't say I only had one surprise. The front door opened. 2 people walked in. A woman in a professional suit carrying a briefcase. Behind her, a man in a U.S. Marshal's uniform. Brad froze. The color drained from his face again. The woman introduced herself. Bradley Harrison? I'm Linda Grant, attorney at law. I represent your father in a federal fraud case against you. The marshal stepped forward. Bradley Harrison, you're under arrest for filing a false death certificate, identity theft, elder abuse, and attempted fraud. Brad's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. Amber backed away from him. Kyle's hands went up like he was already surrendering. How? Brad finally managed. Dad doesn't have a lawyer. He doesn't have money. Linda Grant smiled. It was not a warm smile. Your father's neighbor, George, contacted Legal Aid Services 4 days ago when he discovered what you'd done. Legal Aid connected your father with my office. I specialize in elder abuse cases. When I heard what you did, I took the case pro bono. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. I've spent the last 48 hours working with the Veterans Affairs Office, Social Security Administration, and federal authorities. We have an emergency court order suspending your father's death status pending investigation. All property transfers are frozen. Your access to this house is revoked immediately. The marshal pulled out handcuffs. Turn around, Mr. Harrison. Brad looked at me. Really looked at me. For a second I saw my son as he'd been, 12 years old, crying at his mother's funeral, holding my hand. Then that image vanished and I saw what he'd become. A man so consumed by greed he'd tried to murder his own father. Brad tried to run. The marshal was faster. He had Brad's arms behind his back and cuffed in seconds. Amber tried to slip out the door. 2 police officers were waiting outside. They'd been there the whole time, coordinating with Linda and the marshal. They arrested Amber and Kyle as accomplices. Brad twisted in the handcuffs, looking back at me. "Dad, come on! I'm your son! You can't do this to me!" I felt something break inside me. Not anger anymore. Just deep, infinite sadness. "I didn't do this to you, Brad. You did this to yourself." "You were always so selfish," Brad shouted as the marshal pulled him toward the door. "That house is worth almost $1 million. I deserved it. I deserved something after everything I went through." "You deserve nothing," I said quietly. "I worked my entire life for this house. Your mother and I built our life here, and you threw me away like garbage for money." Amber was crying as the police let her out. Kyle was cursing and blaming Brad, but Brad just stared at me with pure hatred. "You're really going to send your own son to prison?" he said. "What kind of father are you?" I met his eyes one last time. "The kind who loved you more than you ever loved me. And that's something you'll have time to think about." The marshal took Brad out of my house. Police cars filled the street, lights flashing blue and red. Neighbors came out of their houses. They'd all thought I was dead. Now I was standing on my own front porch, watching my son be arrested. George came running from his house. He grabbed me in a tight hug. "Matthew, my God, you did it. You actually did it." I could only nod. I was too tired for words, too emotionally drained. I looked at Linda Grant. She was talking to the police, coordinating statements. She saw me watching and came over. "We got everything on video," she said. "Brad's conversation with his lawyer, his admission that he knew you were alive, his threats. It's all recorded. This is an airtight case." "What happens now?" I asked. "Court hearing in 3 days to officially reverse your death certificate. After that, you regain access to everything. Your house, your accounts, all of it. Brad will be charged federally. Elder abuse, fraud, filing false government documents. He's looking at 8 to 15 years in prison. 8 to 15 years. My son. In prison. Because of choices he made. Because he valued money more than his own father." I sat down on my porch steps. The adrenaline was wearing off. My body was remembering the last 4 days. The abandonment, the illness, the journey, the fear. Everything crashed over me at once. George sat beside me. We didn't speak. We just sat there while police processed the scene, and neighbors whispered, and the night slowly gave way to dawn. The next 3 days passed in a strange blur. Linda Grant handled everything with ruthless efficiency. She'd built a case that was, as she put it, prosecutor's dream. Brad had been sloppy in his greed. He'd left a trail of evidence that even a first-year law student could follow. The emergency court hearing was brief. Linda presented my VA hospital records, my military service documentation, Richard's affidavit from El Paso, George's video footage, and my own testimony. The judge looked at Brad's forged death certificate, looked at me sitting alive in his courtroom, and declared the death certificate null and void. My legal status as a living person was restored. My access to my bank accounts, my property, everything, came back instantly. Brad tried to argue through his public defender that it was all a misunderstanding, that he'd genuinely believed I was dead. But Linda played the audio recording of Brad on the phone with his lawyer talking about cremation schedules and house sale timelines. She played George's video of Brad toasting his inheritance and calling me selfish. The evidence was overwhelming. Brad was formally charged with multiple felonies. Elder abuse, which was a serious crime in Oregon. Identity theft. Fraud. Conspiracy. Filing false government documents. Each charge carried years of prison time. The prosecutor said they were pursuing the maximum sentence because of the calculated nature of Brad's crime. He'd planned everything. The trip to Mexico, the document theft, the abandonment, the false death certificate. Every step was premeditated. Amber and Kyle took plea deals immediately. They agreed to testify against Brad in exchange for reduced charges. Amber admitted Brad had told her the plan weeks ago. He'd researched how long it took for a death certificate to become permanent. He'd found a corrupt official in Mexico who'd file the paperwork, no questions asked. He'd planned to have me declared dead, steal the house, sell it quickly, and disappear to another country before anyone could challenge the documents. Kyle admitted he'd helped Brad change the locks and clear out my belongings. He said Brad had promised him $20,000 for his help. None of them showed any real remorse. They were just angry they'd been caught. Brad's trial was set for 3 months out. His bail was denied because the judge considered him a flight risk. He'd already tried to flee the country once by going to Mexico. He'd sit in county jail until trial. I should have felt satisfaction. Justice was being served. The bad guys were being punished. But mostly I just felt empty, tired, old. George helped me clean up the house over the next week. We unpacked all the boxes Brad had packed. We put my photos back on the walls. We returned my furniture to where it belonged. But the house felt different now. Tainted. Every room held memories of that night, of Brad's betrayal, of realizing my own son had tried to kill me for money. Jerry the trucker came to visit. He'd driven back through Portland on his way south and wanted to check on me. We sat on my porch drinking coffee. 2 old men who'd both been betrayed by family. Jerry told me his brother had called recently, wanting to reconcile. Jerry had hung up on him. Some betrayals, he said, couldn't be forgiven. I asked him if he regretted that. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he didn't know. Maybe forgiveness was possible for some people, but not for him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Frank and Helen called from Phoenix. Helen's sister had survived the stroke and was recovering. They were relieved and grateful. When I told them what had happened in Portland, Helen cried. She said she was so glad I'd gotten justice. Frank said if I ever needed anything at all, I should call them. They considered me family now. Linda Grant stopped by my house 2 weeks after the hearing. She sat in my living room, the same room where Brad had been arrested, and told me my case had attracted attention. She said elder abuse was more common than most people realized. Adult children stealing from aging parents. Families fighting over inheritances before the parents were even dead. She'd received over 300 calls from families dealing with similar situations since my story hit the local news. She asked if I'd be willing to share my story publicly, to speak at elder abuse prevention hearings, to help other victims understand they weren't alone and they had rights, to show them that even when everything seemed lost, it was still possible to fight back. I thought about it for a long time. Part of me just wanted to be left alone, to fade into quiet retirement and try to forget the nightmare. But another part of me remembered lying on that Mexico City airport bench, completely alone and helpless, thinking I had no options. If my story could help even one person in that situation, maybe it was worth telling. I agreed. Over the next 6 months, I became an unlikely advocate. I testified at state legislative hearings about elder abuse laws. I spoke at senior centers about protecting yourself from financial exploitation, even when it comes from family. I gave interviews to local news stations. My story spread beyond Portland. National news picked it up. I became the old man who'd fought back against his own son and won. Brad's trial was quick. With Amber and Kyle's testimony, with all the documented evidence, with the recordings and the videos, his defense had nothing to work with. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison. No parole for at least 8 years. I sat in that courtroom and watched my son be led away in handcuffs. He didn't look at me, didn't say anything, just stared straight ahead as the bailiff took him out. I'd expected to feel something. Triumph, vindication, relief. But I just felt sad. Sad for the little boy who'd lost his mother too young. Sad for the man he could have been. Sad for the relationship we'd never have again. After the sentencing, a young lawyer named Timothy approached me in the courthouse hallway. He worked for Elder Legal Services. He said my case had inspired them to create a new rapid response program for elder abuse victims. They'd handled 47 cases in the past 6 months, using tactics similar to what Linda had done for me. 47 families had gotten justice because of my story. That did make me feel something. Not triumph exactly, but purpose. Meaning, like maybe this nightmare had served some greater good. I made a decision about the house. I put it on the market. George argued with me about that. He said I shouldn't let Brad win by giving up my home, but it wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about moving forward. Every room in that house held ghosts now. Sarah's memory was there, but so was Brad's betrayal. I couldn't live with both. The house sold for $925,000. Portland's market had only gotten hotter. After paying off the mortgage and fees, I cleared $750,000. I bought a small two-bedroom condo in a quiet neighborhood near the river. It cost $180,000. With the rest of the money, I set up two things. First, a trust fund for elder abuse legal services. $200,000 to help families who couldn't afford lawyers like Linda. Second, a donation to the Veterans Affairs Hospital in El Paso in Richard's name. $50,000 for their emergency services program. They'd saved my life. Now they could save others. The remaining money I split between various charities, organizations that helped seniors, food banks, homeless shelters. I kept enough to live on comfortably for the rest of my life, but I didn't need much. I'd learned something in Mexico City and Texas, and on that long journey home. I'd learned that the things I thought mattered, the house, the possessions, the accumulated stuff of 50 years, none of that was really important. What mattered was dignity, justice, standing up for yourself even when everything seemed hopeless. Those were the things worth fighting for. I moved into my new condo on a sunny Tuesday in October, exactly 1 year after Brad had abandoned me in Mexico. George helped me move the few pieces of furniture I'd kept. We set up my small living room with photos of Sarah, pictures of Frank and Helen, a framed photo of Jerry at his truck, a picture of Linda Grant and me at the courthouse. My new family, the people who'd stood by me when everything fell apart. George asked me if I ever planned to visit Brad in prison. I said I didn't know. Part of me wanted to. Wanted to ask him why. Wanted to understand how a son could do that to his father. But another part of me knew there was no answer that would satisfy. No explanation that would make sense. Brad had made his choice. He'd have to live with it. I've been in my new place for 6 months now. I'm 71 years old. I volunteer 3 days a week at the senior center, talking to people about financial safety and family dynamics. I've become friends with half a dozen people there. We play cards. We tell stories. We look out for each other. It's a new kind of family. Jerry calls me once a month from whatever highway he's on. Frank and Helen visit twice a year, parking their RV in my condo's guest lot. We have dinner and talk about life and loss, and moving forward. Linda stops by sometimes, usually with another client who needs to hear that fighting back is possible. I'm writing a book about my experience. Timothy from Elder Legal Services is helping me. We're calling it The Ghost Who Came Back. It's part memoir, part guidebook for elder abuse victims. It's scheduled to publish next year. Every cent from the book sales will go to elder abuse prevention programs. People ask me if I've forgiven Brad. I tell them honestly, I don't know. Forgiveness is complicated. I don't hate him. I don't wish him harm. But I can't forget what he did. Maybe that's enough. Maybe forgiveness isn't always about reconciliation. Maybe it's just about letting go of the anger, so it doesn't poison the rest of your life. Last month, I got a letter from Brad. It was the first communication I'd had from him since the trial. He didn't apologize. He didn't admit he was wrong. He just wrote that prison had given him time to think, that he was taking classes, that he was trying to be a better person. He didn't ask me to visit, didn't ask for money or help, just said he wanted me to know he was still alive. Still my son. I haven't written back yet. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. I'm still deciding. What I've learned through all of this is simple. You're never too old to fight for yourself. You're never too powerless to demand justice. Even when everything is stacked against you, when the law says you're dead, when your own family has betrayed you, when you're alone in a foreign country with nothing but the clothes on your back, you still have choices. You can give up, or you can fight. I chose to fight, and I won. Not because I was special, not because I was lucky, but because I refused to let my son's cruelty define the end of my story. My house wasn't my life. My dignity was. And nobody, not even my own son, could take that from me. So I want to ask you something. Have you ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? Someone in your own family? How did you handle it? Did you fight back? Or did you walk away? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If this story touched you, if it made you think about your own family relationships, or gave you hope that justice is possible even in the darkest situations, please hit that like button. Subscribe to hear more stories like this. Real stories about real people, facing real challenges, and finding the strength to overcome them. And please share this with someone who might need to hear it. Someone who might be facing their own betrayal. Someone who needs to know they're not alone and they're not powerless. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here. I hope you never face what I faced. But if you do, I hope you remember that you have more strength than you think. You have more options than you realize. And you're never too old to fight for what's right. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And remember, family is the people who stand by you when everything falls apart, not always the people you share blood with. Until next time.